Hi, my name's Don Stewart. A few years back, I converted an old 17-foot fiberglass sailboat into a great little electric power cruiser. We enjoyed the final product so much, and it was such a great outcome, that I went ahead and put together this presentation to show people how it was done. The boat started out as a used Venture 17. I was quite surprised to find out how inexpensive it was to buy an older sailboat in this size range on Craigslist. This picture and the next one show you pretty well what the boat looked like when we first got it home. It was actually in quite nice shape. Here in this picture, you can see the small carport area I used for this project. I tarped it in the wintertime, as you'll see. The first step was, of course, to create a hoist so I could lift the boat off the trailer and also so I could roll it over when necessary to work on the bottom. I also needed a cradle that was on casters so I could move it around as I needed to get access to various parts of the boat in the tight space. Without a shadow of a doubt, the most dramatic and unnerving step in this project was when I actually cut into this perfectly good little sailboat in order to remove the existing cabin and cockpit. I have to admit, there was at least a moment of self-doubt here. Here you can see in the picture how I went about it, just with a simple little jigsaw. And in this photo, you can see the full extent of what was being done to the boat at this stage. The entire cabin and cockpit were removed and ultimately discarded, with the exception of the hatch cover and drop door and the cabin windows. But in this picture, you can see it all being removed from the original boat. And here in this picture, you can see the cabin and cockpit laying out in the backyard where they ended up for the duration of the project. Here in this picture, you can see what the boat looked like after the cabin and cockpit were removed. Basically, it was a bare hull, although I did, of course, retain the deck itself for later use, as you'll see. And here in this picture is I guess, the master carpenter himself looking at the project after I'd cut the guts out of this boat and wondering whether I had perhaps made a huge mistake. After removal of the cabin and the cockpit, I also removed the entire deck structure so that I could move on to the next stage of this project, which was adding to the boat's freeboard. Here are these pieces laying out in my backyard. The next step in this project was to lay up some long fiberglass panels that were cut to size and then bolted in place to the hull in such a manner that I added about 5.5 inches of new freeboard. That was roughly what I'd calculated would be needed, given that I anticipated adding a considerable amount of weight in the form of 16 6-volt lead-acid batteries. The bottom edge of the new panels was bolted and sealed with 5200 compound to the outside of the hull, and the original deck was then lowered into place over the panels so that the panels went up underneath the existing deck. I used stainless carriage bolts for this and teak strips as rub rails. One could, I suppose, if wished, probably countersink those bolts and install wood plugs, but I actually preferred the semi-industrial look resulting with the carriage bolts being visible. After everything was in place, I then came back and glassed the various joints at the bow, along the sides, and at the corners of the stern. In this picture, you can get a pretty good idea how the caulking and the bolting together was done. Didn't worry about the seams. where these panels joined because I knew I could come back and fiberglass those later. So all this was basically to create about 5.5 new inches of freeboard for the boat. And here's a view of the same panels at the rear corner of the boat. This was after I had done the fiberglassing of the corners, so you can see how easy it was to make that look nice after the fact. This was another one of the perhaps unnerving points in this work, cutting a big hole in the bottom of the boat. This is the starting point for installing the interior motor well that I wanted to use for this. This is the motor well designed to accommodate a standard long shaft outboard motor. The sailboat drop keel was removed and discarded, and the keel well was also removed, and the opening was simply glassed over, which is what you see going on in this picture. After the sailboat keel was removed, I designed and built a normal powerboat keel just out of plywood. The whole setup was designed so that the outboard engine, which couldn't be tilted up because of the well it was in, would not extend below the final keel and would thus be protected possibly from passing debris, or be protected if the boat was grounded or beached. The new keel was then very thoroughly fiberglassed over and in place so that I didn't have any leakage of water into the wood that was basically supporting it. In this picture, you get a look inside the boat after the keel well was removed. You can also see the beginnings of the flat floor that I installed to provide a surface for the batteries to rest. After installing this floor, the space beneath it was filled with pour foam, as were the spaces on both sides underneath the seating cabinets. So you can see on both sides here, those long white spaces were filled with pour foam, and all of that pour foam added a good deal of stiffening to the boat. Although after all the structure was in place, it was pretty solid in any case. Here is a view of the very beginnings of the interior framing. The batteries go down under the floor, as you can see it there. I can say it took some significant thought to feel confident my plan would provide comfortable seating with adequate foot space for several people, while also having sufficient height so that passengers would feel safely contained inside the boat when it was rolling around out on the water. That was part of the reason that I designed it with the additional coaming around the top, which you'll see in later pictures here. So here you can see the initial construction of the seats, and also can see the scuppers that I built around them to make sure water would drain out. I made the floor perfectly rectangular so that I'd have a convenient place for the batteries and would be able to create a floor that lifted up on hinges along the outside edges. In order to provide a nice curved shape and give the cockpit the feel of a curved seating area that matched the curve of the outside of the boat itself, I matched that shape just using the seat covers themselves, which were curved, and you'll see that in later pictures. I think it turned out just fine. Here you can see the scuppered insets around the seats and the curved seat covers that gave the seats their shape and provided adequate seating width for someone to be comfortable sitting there. In this picture, you can see the side storage areas that were left. These were basically clamped tightly into place with screws. You also might note the L-shaped seat cover at the front of the boat that hinged up also with a piano hinge and provided very nice access to the area under the front deck. So the boat ended up actually having quite a bit of quite convenient storage. Again, here's an area of the side storage compartments. In this shot, you can also see what was to later become the console for mounting the steering wheel and the throttle mechanism for the engine. The pilot seat is just to the left, just aft of that, so it provided a separate location for the person operating the boat to sit, and actually was quite a fun place from which to operate this little boat. I wanted a nice curve at the front corners of the cockpit, and in order to give it that, I was able, since I was using fiberglass, to just accomplish this with multiple strips of 3/8 inch plywood, which you can see in this picture and in some later ones. Then once that's all glassed over, it became quite strong and quite adequate for the purpose. In this shot, you can see how the cockpit's interior shape and seat depth was achieved by simply curving the seat covers while leaving the actual cockpit floor in the shape of a simple rectangle. And in this picture, you can see the beginnings of the framing of the aft cabin. If you take a look in through the window to the lower right, you can see how I was able to leave a space under the cockpit seats to provide the length needed inside for a full 6-foot quarter berth, both sides of the boat, allowing the boat to sleep two adults quite comfortably. Here is another shot of the cabin framing. The window shape here, by the way, was dictated by the aluminum frame windows that I salvaged from the original cabin of the Venture 17. In this shot, one can begin to get a feel for what the final boat is going to look like. Also, you can note that the front joint at the very top of the bow on my freeboard panels, this joint has been fiberglassed at this stage, and again, you can see how easy that would be to do. This is just a quick view to show you the emerging aft cabin as it was shaping up. This shot gives you a look at the beginnings of some of the glasswork that followed the wood framing. If you look up near the bow, you can see the 3/8 inch plywood wood strips at the curves of the front of the combing that I used in order to give that the curved shape. Later, after that was glassed over, it looked perfect. Again, here's more glasswork visible. You can also in this picture see how nice and large the access was into the area under the front deck. The L-shaped hatch cover that went on here just worked like a charm, lifted up out of the way and provided you with plenty of access to get at that area. It turned out to be a great storage area. Here's a later shot in which you can see that things are beginning to come together a bit more after some of the glasswork is dressed up and smoothed off a bit. As you can see in this picture and the one to follow, I used, I guess you could say, 1 or 2 hand clamps to install the teak around the combing for the cockpit. This combing was installed and attached using stainless bolts and finish washers for this. Everything was caulked up with 5200. There was a trim board installed around the top to dress it up and make it into a nice looking finished product. And here in this picture you can see how the combing is starting to come together, and you can kind of see how it went together here. In this picture one can see the flush recessed stainless steel flange nuts that I used on the inside of the combing to attach the teak to the outside. Those were nice and smooth and finished at the end so that you could then put the upholstery in and not have to worry about a thing. Here you can see the finished aft cabin and the hatch cover and drop door. The hatch cover itself was actually saved from the old boat, and I just used it over again. Worked like a charm. And also the drop door, I used the same drop door to install here, and those provided nice open access, and in fact when they were opened you could stand in the aft cockpit or in the aft cabin and feel quite comfortable there. Here in this picture you can see that the floor is in the cockpit floor. It was in two long panels hinged at the outside edges with piano hinges. These floor sections rested on a rubber seal. The odd-looking pieces of plywood at the ends of the floor there are actually a mechanism that I designed to hold the floor down tight against the rubber seal. So this gives you a pretty good idea of what the cockpit was beginning to look like as the boat progressed. Here you can see that the cabin windows are in. They were the aluminum windows that I removed from the old boat. Later on, I built some nice little solid teak pieces that capped off the tail ends of the coaming there where it joins the cabin. And you can see those little rounded pieces of teak in later pictures. In this picture you can also see the trim for the aft cabin also going into place. In this picture, the coaming and the trim are basically complete, and we're getting along to the point where I can start painting and oiling and making this thing look a little nicer. In this picture, you can see some of the finished work is beginning and that the cockpit floor is in place. I still haven't installed here the power controls or completed the steering console, but you can note that the cockpit floor is in place, and it should be noted also that it was slightly above the outside water level. There in a position just beneath the pilot's seat, I had a drain, but the drain was protected by a valve that I kept shut off most of the time to prevent backwash, but it could be opened in calm circumstances to drain the water out of the cockpit if you ever got any in there, which we never really did. So in this picture you can see that I'm beginning to put in the mechanical aspects of all of this. The steering wheel is in, and as you'll see in the next picture, the rudder is in place. So things are beginning to make it start to look like a boat here. Here's a view from the stern in which you can see the rudder. The rudder needed to be removed for trailering this boat, but it was actually quite easy to slip it out and back in position as needed. I opted to steer the boat with a rudder rather than with the motor itself because I wanted the motor well to be filled with removable fiberglass foam blocking that filled in the bottom of the well in a manner that provided a nice, smooth, fair bottom surface for the boat in the area of the motor well. I didn't want the well to create an area of turbulent water that would considerably diminish this electric boat's efficiency. In this picture, you can see the two banks of 8 6-volt batteries, 16 batteries total. None of the wiring has yet been put in place in this picture. I should mention there was also a 120-volt battery charger installed in the cabin, and that was plenty of charging capacity to charge it up fully overnight for any usage that we ever made of the boat. So a big day, the naming of the boat and the printing of the name on the hull, as you'll see in this picture and in the next. Here was the big day of launch. This is at Stan Sayers Park on Lake Washington in Seattle. This is the first test drive of this boat. In this picture, we're no doubt at full power. I used a Torqeedo 4, which provides about 8 horsepower to drive this boat, but given my experience with it, I probably could have easily opted for the smaller engine, the Torqeedo 2, which provides closer to 5 horsepower. And were I to do it again, that's what I would have done. That would have been plenty of power. There's no way one would ever need to drive this boat at its full 6 knots, and you can pretty well see that just by looking at this picture. So here is the finished electric frog. It has a bimini. It's a fully upholstered. The bow pulpit that you see there came off the original boat, and this is pretty much the way it was from that point forward, and we started making use of it. Here I am with a friend after a nice little trip around Lake Washington, coming into Leschi Marina. You can see what the boat looked like out on the water here. And this is a view from Stan Sayers Park on Lake Washington, looking north. The Mercer Island floating bridges in the background, with a bit of Mount Baker showing above the horizon. Again, this picture was probably taken with the boat under full power. The truth was, we almost never operated it like this. Ordinarily, we would cut that back to at least about 5 knots, and the boat slipped through the water quite nicely, and it greatly extended its range of operation. Here are some final specifications for the Electric Frog. It had a remarkably fine operating time. There was no way we would ever have used that. If we'd ever wanted to go anywhere at a great distance, all you needed to do was slow the boat down just a little bit, and its range of operation dramatically increased. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video useful. The final boat was quite fun and easy to use. It was great for entertaining. We had 6 people aboard on multiple occasions, and there was plenty of space. Incidentally, if you have an interest in mystery novels or in research and my writings on natural resources and the environment, I invite you to check out my personal website at donstewart.net. Thank you again.